I view Kinsey as one of the most treasonous Americans in human history.
The charge of treason might sound a bit extreme, but the evidence shows that Kinsey's desire to document the most depraved sexual behavior led him to work with a man who seemed to personify evil itself, a Nazi pedophile named Dr. Fritz von Balusek.
Dr. von Balusek was a Nazi officer, Gestapo member of the Gestapo, one of the original Nazis, by the way, joined the party very early. He was in charge of a Polish town, and he was a pedophile.
Years after the war, von Balusek was arrested and put on trial for the murder of a 10-year-old girl who had been found naked and throttled on a piece of wasteland. The German authorities suspected von Balusek of the crime because the same girl had been listed among several hundred children he had raped, the details of which he had recorded in his pseudo-scientific diaries. The German newspapers called him the most important pedophile in the criminal history of Berlin. During the war, von Balusek used his authority as a Nazi officer to fulfill his pedophile desires. The full number of children he abused and ultimately murdered is still unknown.
When he was arrested for rape of many children, but also possible murder of a little girl, all of the German newspapers spoke about this on the headlines. It was in the headlines of every newspaper in Germany.
During the war, von Balusek was the commandant of the Polish town of Jędrzejów. There he threatened the children with certain death if they refused his sexual desires. What he recorded in his diaries of how he treated these children was so criminal that during his trial, the judge cried out, quote, "This is no longer human."
He had told the children that it was either the smokestacks or it was him. And it turned out that all the children ended up apparently in the smokestacks anyway. Post-World War II, he was highly placed in civic government, and he was arrested for this possible murder and being investigated. And in the process, they found that he had been corresponding extensively with Kinsey, that Dr. Kinsey had warned him to be aware and careful of the authorities so he shouldn't get caught.
The German authorities learned that von Balusek and Kinsey had a working relationship, and that Dr. Kinsey was well aware of the vicious abuse the Nazi pedophile was inflicting upon innocent children. At his trial, the judge said to von Balusek, "I got the impression that you got to the children in order to impress Kinsey and to deliver him material." To which von Balusek replied, "Kinsey himself asked me for that."
The German press was outraged, and the judge was outraged.
The judge went on to say, instead of answering his sordid letters, the strange American scholar should have rather made sure that Mr. von Balusek was put behind bars. The German press reported that Kinsey's letters to the Nazi contained warnings to watch out or be careful of getting caught. They wrote that in his diaries, von Balusek stuck in the letters from the sex researcher Kinsey, in which he'd been encouraged to continue his research. He had also started relationships to expand his researches. One shivers to think of the lengths he went to. At some point, the German authorities tried to get hold of information on von Balusek from the Kinsey Institute.
The Kinsey Institute, even though they knew they were dealing with a Nazi and a paedophile, when the German authorities wanted, for the purposes of this murder investigation, wanted to get hold of that information, the Kinsey Institute refused, and Gebhardt said to me, and indeed on camera, that they would have destroyed any evidence before they handed it over to the police.
Paul Gebhardt said of this event that the FBI put pressure on Kinsey to reveal the guy's sexual diary, but Kinsey said absolutely not. Gebhardt went on to say the poor pedophile had his reputation destroyed, finally quit corresponding with us. While German media documented the story heavily, the American press, under the powerful influence of the tax-exempt foundations, gave almost no attention to the story, even though Kinsey's research, which had turned the country upside down, was almost certainly based in part on the sexual abuse done by a Nazi pedophile during the Second World War. It is entirely likely that von Balusek's letters to Kinsey can still be found in the records of the Kinsey Institute even today. Kinsey's willingness to work with the devil at one point seemed to take on a very literal meaning.
One of the interesting things I found several years ago in researching the Satanist Aleister Crowley was the influence that he has had on so many people here in the United States of America. And one of the men that he had influenced was Alfred Kinsey.
After publishing his male and female reports, Kinsey began to travel abroad and study sexuality in foreign countries. In his book, Kinsey co-author Wardell Pomeroy wrote that Kinsey went looking for a prized item, the diaries of Aleister Crowley.
Crowley died just a year before Kinsey's book came out.
Crowley was a famous and highly controversial British occultist in the early part of the 20th century. His sexual exploits in bizarre and sometimes deadly satanic rituals had been exposed in the London newspapers.
He also talked about taking a virgin and having sexual relations with her, and then upon a climax to actually murder her, cut her in 6 pieces, and put the names of the various demon gods on those 6 limbs, those 6 parts of her body.
Taking the name for the Antichrist in the Bible, Crowley called himself the Beast 666. His famous saying was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," by which he justified all forms of immorality.
Crowley had a sex temple and had practiced group sex and orgies and what have you, and so-called sex magic. Crowley was into pedophilia. He was into justifying his pedophilia. In fact, he had said, "Let me seduce the boys of England." He wanted to seduce them, and then he starts talking about sodomy and it should be acceptable. So, I mean, it was quite shocking, especially back then.
Pomeroy wrote that Crowley was called by Lord Douglas the wickedest man who ever lived, and his sexual history alone was enough to earn him the title he gloried in, the Beast. Crowley kept a diary up to his death. 2 weeks after Kinsey tracked down these papers in England, he found himself in the temple that the Beast had founded in Sicily. Kinsey is pictured here inside Crowley's temple, known as the Abbey Thelema, where he performed his satanic rituals. On the wall is a picture of Crowley himself, while across from Kinsey is another man named Kenneth Anger. Anger was a close acquaintance who appeared in some of Kinsey's sex films, made in the attic of his Bloomington home. As an avant-garde filmmaker, Anger was deeply involved in the occult. He directed films with titles such as Lucifer Rising and The Invocation of My Demon Brother.
Kenneth Anger is a co-founder of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, and Kenneth Anger also was, had a penchant for younger men, for sure. Bobby Beausoleil was his live-in boyfriend. That's the same Bobby Beausoleil that committed the first murder, killing Hinman for Charles Manson. That was his live-in boyfriend. He played Lucifer in one of his occult movies that extolled the virtues of Aleister Crowley's magic and what have you.
In this image from one of Anger's films, we see Bobby Beausoleil, who would later become one of Charles Manson's killers. He's standing next to a doorway with Crowley's maxim, "Do what thou wilt," painted on the door. A phrase that certainly fit with Kinsey's own view of human sexuality.
Pomeroy even admits that Kinsey loved Crowley's writings, including specifically mentioning some of his homosexual erotica. One of his books called White Stains.
Kenneth Anger is quoted saying that Kinsey was obsessed with obtaining the great beast's day-to-day sex diaries. To obtain grant monies and maintain the support of the university, Kinsey needed the excuse of research to validate his 24 hours a day obsession with sex. However, Kinsey's battle cry of "do your best and let other people react as they will" seemed a variation on Crowley's "do what thou wilt" maxim. An older Kenneth Anger is pictured here, with the name Lucifer tattooed on his chest. So important was Anger's relationship with Kinsey that to this day, the Kinsey Institute Library features a Kenneth Anger collection with an archive of Anger's films as well as the correspondence between him and Alfred Kinsey. Should America be disturbed that the father of her sexual revolution, who changed American law and laid the foundation for sex education, had such associations? If America continues to be influenced by Kinsey, what will it mean for her future? What Kinsey discovered at Crowley's mysterious abbey might provide a clue. Pomeroy writes that Crowley's curious magnetism drew people from all over the world, who came and became his sexual slaves. Some of these women left their husbands to enter the temple. They held group orgies as part of their ritual and included in them the small children the women had brought. He further reveals that inside the abbey, Kinsey found paintings, life-sized representations of sexual activity, including children. Some have considered the possibility that Aleister Crowley was another of Kinsey's pedophiles who kept his diaries as part of Kinsey's sex research.
I would be surprised if Kinsey was not, in fact, either paying or communicating with Crowley regarding his sex diaries, because Crowley was more open and more public with his sexual exploits than pretty much anybody of the time. He was known as the wickedest man on the earth long before Kinsey would have gone to him. He was far more accessible than, say, a Nazi officer in Germany to Kinsey, and as ugly as Crowley was to so many people, he wasn't nearly as known, or there wasn't the reputation that there was with the Nazis. And at the same time, Crowley could have used the money in the 1940s. He had, he wasn't as rich as he was. He had spent a lot of his money, so he would have been more open to that. And then to see that Kinsey was actually reading Crowley's stuff, we know that from Pomeroy. And it would be hard to believe that he wasn't already working with Crowley and encouraging Crowley to continue on with his sexual exploits. One way or another, the net effect is the same. Kinsey was fostering much of the same revolution that Crowley had begun over in England, and was helping continue what Crowley hoped would take place in the United States of America.